Take my lips, O Lord, and speak through them. Take our minds, O Lord, and think through them. Take our hearts, O Lord, and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. Last season, we learned something profound from our Grow to Give garden. You know, the one that we plant across the pond, that we plant to feed our food insecure neighbors. Well, life got complicated. Mary Beth was leaving her employment here. Time got away from us, and for an entire season, we left the garden untended. Now, what happened there wasn't death, but rather an explosion of life. Just not the kind that we had hoped for. Weeds wrapped around our tomato cages. Others sprouted where we planned for lettuce. Morning glories, beautiful but insistent, claimed the bean trellises as their own. The garden wasn't dead or empty. It was bursting with life. But it wasn't feeding those who needed feeding. The plants, well, they weren't bad or wrong. Many were even beautiful and valuable in their own right. But without tending, without ordering, without purposeful care, the garden's original mission of feeding the hungry was lost in the wild tangle of competing lives. Now, standing there in that overgrown space, I realized that I wasn't looking at just an untended garden. Instead, I was looking at a mirror of my own heart. Like that garden, our hearts are meant to bear fruit that feeds others. Like that garden, our hearts can become so full of good things growing in the wrong places that they no longer serve their deeper purpose. This is what St. Augustine meant when he wrote of the order of love, or the Ordo Amoris, which is a theological concept that has received an unexpected political bump in recent weeks. St. Augustine never meant that some of our loves are wrong, but rather that without careful tending, even good loves can overwhelm better ones. When we returned to that overgrown garden, we had a choice to make. Tear everything out in frustration. That would have been a different kind of very satisfying disorder, responding to chaos with destruction. Or we could get on our knees in the dirt and begin the patient work of discernment, thinking about which volunteers could be transplanted to better spots, which aggressive vines might be trained up trellises where their vigor could provide shade to our intended crops. This is what Jesus is teaching us about love. He says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? He's not condemning our natural affections. They're just like those vigorous vines. They're good. But they need direction, need lifting, need purpose beyond their first wild growth. Sometimes, what appears to be disrupting our plans might actually be inviting us into a deeper understanding of God's abundant care. If our untended garden shows us how our personal loves can grow disordered, our pond and our watershed reveal something even more challenging about love's wider ecology. You all know that over the past several years, we've been growing a ministry of spiritual solidarity with our pond. And we've learned over time that our pond's waters are growing less hospitable to life over time. And that's not because anyone particularly wishes harm to our pond or its creatures, but because somewhere upstream, someone's lawn chemicals seemed harmless enough. The LIRR's parking lot runoff didn't seem worth the expense of proper drainage. Somewhere by the Northern State Parkway, someone's development project prioritized quick profits over careful planning. Now, no single person intended to harm the delicate web of life in our pond. They were simply loving the wrong things in the wrong order. Loving green lawns more than clean water. Loving convenience more than community. Loving short-term gain more than long-term flourishing. This is what disordered love looks like. It's not usually malice, but disconnection. Not hatred, just forgetting how our choices ripple out beyond our sight. When Jesus says, "Do not judge and you will not be judged," perhaps he's inviting us to look deeper than blame. The person who poured chemicals on their lawn isn't our enemy. They're our neighbor who hasn't yet learned to see how their patch of earth connects to ours, how their choices flow downstream into our shared waters. This is what Jesus means when he says, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." God's mercy is not about ignoring harm. It's about seeing beneath it to the disconnection that caused it in the first place. God's mercy is about helping each other relearn our place in the web of life and love. Now, we've seen how love needs tending in our personal lives, how our disconnection from each other can poison the very waters we share. But what happens? What happens when ordering our loves comes with a real price, when doing what's right costs us something tangible? This is where Jesus' words become both challenge and promise. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Peter Sedilis is the owner of the Golden Dolphin Diner in Huntington, formerly the Golden Globe. When Peter hung Israeli flags and posted pictures of the hostages from Hamas's attack on Israel after October 7th in his windows, he says he wasn't trying to create controversy. He was simply standing with those that he saw were suffering. He put up a sign, "Greek diners stand with Israel," it read, a statement of solidarity with the afflicted. Now, the response was swift and costly. 3 staff members immediately quit. Delivery drivers refused to take orders from the Golden Dolphin. His business suddenly vanished from all the delivery apps, and customers threatened him. In 1 week, he lost 40% of his business. Now, I had lunch at the Golden Dolphin with a colleague recently, and I guess the sight of 2 men in collars invited Peter to be a bit more open, and he shared with us that each night, he says, each night I pray for them all. The staff who left, the people who threaten us, everyone caught up in this cycle of hatred. Not that they'll change their minds, though that would be nice. I pray for their families, their peace of mind, their own wrestling with what's right. Whatever drives someone to threaten a small diner, there must be so much pain there. But how, my colleague asked, how do you do that after how they're treating you? He was quiet for a moment, and he said, "Look, someone I trust told me once I had a choice. I could become bitter. I could let this turn me against whole groups of people, or I could remember that we're all caught up in something bigger than a diner in Huntington. I'm not there yet," he said. "Some days are harder than others, but each prayer changes something in me." Now, the natural response to such treatment might be anger, it might be retaliation, it might be removing the displays to save his business. But Peter kept those pictures up. He kept the flags flying. He kept praying. And something remarkable has happened. Business has begun to boom. People are lining up for tables. Even kosher Jews who can't eat at his non-kosher restaurant come by to express their thanks and support. But here's what strikes me about this story. It's not primarily about who was right or wrong in a complex political situation. It's about what happens when we order our loves according to conscience rather than convenience. When we choose to stand with those who suffer, even at personal cost. When we refuse to let fear of loss determine our actions, and most importantly, when we remember to pray for those who oppose us, recognizing their humanity, even in the midst of our conflict. All these examples teach us important lessons about love. Here's the greatest. Love is inexhaustible. Like a well-tended garden, it produces more. Like a well-tended garden that produces more than we could ever eat alone. Like a healthy watershed that keeps giving life season after season. Like a little diner in Huntington that ends up serving more people than before a conflict. When we cultivate love properly, it grows beyond our imagining. Yes, love needs ordering. Yes, love requires careful tending. But this tending isn't about constraint, it's about capacity. Every time we transplant a volunteer plant to where it can flourish without overwhelming others, we expand our garden's abundance. Every time we protect our watershed, we multiply its life-giving potential. Every time we choose to pray for those who oppose us, we stretch our heart's capacity to love more. And this is what Jesus means when he says, "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap." He's not describing a transaction, he's describing transformation. When we learn to love wildly but wisely, generously but intentionally, we discover that love is the one resource that multiplies as you spend it. So, where do we begin? Perhaps right where we are. Maybe when you think about that colleague who's always criticizing your work, you could listen for the fear behind their words next time. That neighbor whose political signs make your blood boil, they might need help carrying their groceries from the car to the house. That family member who hurt you deeply, well, come into church someday, light a candle for them, not to excuse their actions, but to remember their humanity. Start small. Start right where you are. Tend your love like your garden. Care for it like a watershed. Make it a priority like a diner owner, making time to pray for those who threatened his business. Don't think for a moment that this discipline will constrain your love. Instead, it will free you to love more generously and more abundantly than you ever thought possible. Amen.